morning, everyone. Good afternoon to some of you who are calling in from different time zones. I am Patsy Low, Chief of Staff at AVPN and Policy Advisor, and I would like to warmly welcome all of you to today's webinar on Investing in a Green Recovery, Public-Private Responses for a Climate Resilient Future. This is the final session in a series of webinars focused on the COVID-19 response and recovery and the implications for Asia's future, organized in partnership with the UNDP. We thank very much to the UNDP for their partnership, and we're excited to see many of you online with us today. As an introduction to the session, we want to talk about how the pandemic, while posing an enormous challenge to countries all around the world that having triggered a global economic slowdown, also have implications for stimulus towards economic growth that need to have long-lasting effects and therefore chosen carefully for the various countries in this region. What governments need to avoid is trying to boost economic growth in the wake of one global health crisis by exacerbating another, namely climate change. The growing urgency of the climate crisis shows the dire need for immediate measures to drastically cut emissions now. Given new developments with clean technologies, the opportunities to do so have never been better. Taking bold climate action, such as increasing renewable energy capacity, can stimulate economic growth while also meeting climate targets and ultimately the SDGs. However, bold action in this form does not have to be from governments alone. With this premise today, we do want to look at where post-crisis recovery programs can present an opportunity to align public policies more closely with climate objectives. We will be discussing how forthcoming stimulus packages may be designed to orient investment towards sectors that can accelerate the transition towards a low carbon future and improve our resilience to future shocks from climate change. We will also hope to identify the kinds of bold actions and examples of innovations that can be taken in order to manage this new world of multiple risks and how public and private sector actors can hold hands to meet the challenge together. So without further ado, let me firstly provide a very quick logistics instruction to everyone about what we can expect today. Please note that we have 75 minutes for today's session. We will be hearing from a keynote speaker, and that will be followed by a panel of esteemed experts to join us in a dialogue, and then opening up for questions from the audience. We'd like to remind the audience that you should include your questions in the Q&A box, which you can see the icon for at the bottom of your screen. We will also like to invite you to say hello to everybody in the chat box as we begin our session. We will be turning off the chat box once we begin our panel conversation so that we can pay our attention to the Q&As that are coming in. Please also forgive us if in the interest of time, we may not be able to address all questions, but we will certainly do our best. We will be raising your questions verbally to the panelists to answer. And if we have the ability to do so, we will certainly provide some written responses to your questions after the session as well, to be posted on our website. Please also note that today's session is going to be recorded. The recording and all the resources that will be presented by our panelists will be uploaded on the AVPN website approximately a week after this webinar, so do please keep your eyes open for this update. Let me now introduce our speakers for today. As I introduce them, I'd like to invite them to also please turn on your camera and perhaps wave hello to the audience. First of all, let me introduce Mr. Balazs Horvat, who is the RBAP Senior Economic and Strategic Advisor on Belt and Road Initiative at UNDP Asia Pacific. He is an experienced leader with a strong analytical economic and development background. In his current roles, he has led teams that have produced publications, including the social and economic impact of COVID-19 in the Asia Pacific region. Prior to this, he has served as the director of the UNDP Seoul Policy Center and the country director in UNDP's South Sudan country office. He has also worked in Europe and CIS Regional Center of UNDP as the Poverty Reduction Practice Acting Director. Thank you very much, Mr. Balas, for joining us. Let me also briefly introduce our other panelist speakers, and then we will turn over to Mr. Balas for his keynote remarks. I'd like to quickly ask Ms. Megan Argyru to please turn on your camera and wave hello to the audience. Meg is the head of international programs at ClimateWorks Australia. She leads ClimateWorks International Work Program with a focus on Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. She has designed and is leading the organization's new agenda setting program, Pathways to Prosperity, Achieving Lowest Emissions Development, and the SDGs. Previously, Meg was leading the engagement team, where she has provided strategic oversight for ClimateWorks stakeholder management and the organization's communication strategies to advance progress on climate change. Thank you for joining us, Megan. I also like to introduce Mr. Muhammad Yusriki Muliawan, Managing Director at PT Basis Utama Prima, also known as Basis Investments. Basis Investments is a boutique investment company focusing on promoting renewable energy and creating funds for investing in the renewable energy space in Indonesia. Batyus has joined a prominent association in renewable energy, the Indonesia Smart Grid Initiative, and was appointed as the head of investment and mega projects. The association is very active in advocating for stakeholders in Indonesia to accelerate the energy transition process in response to Indonesia's greenhouse gas reduction targets. We will also hear later on from Batyus as well. So now, let me now turn the microphone over to Mr. Balas Horvath, who will share with us some very thought-provoking comments to start us off with today's discussion. Mr. Balas, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, Patsian, and greetings to everyone. It's really an honor to present today. I will have a big picture focus, giving the broad context, then discuss the key necessary aspects of fiscal stimulus packages. This speaks to the importance of the composition of the fiscal stimulus, not only its size. Some aspects highlighted will show that a considerable part of the funds needed for the interventions to attain a climate resilient path can be identified domestically. Hence, the rise in public debt need not be so large that it precipitates a debt crisis, which is an existing risk. So let me start by setting the stage. COVID-19 and climate change are large, initially uncorrelated global shocks hitting the economy, society, and the environment at the same time. They come on top of ongoing megatrends like demographic shifts, accelerating technological advances, globalization, and urbanization. They also come on top of accumulated fiscal, monetary, and external imbalances, and social ones like escalating inequality and increasingly binding planetary constraints. What results out of this mix is a volatile situation with heightened uncertainty. In a situation like this, foresight is essential. Our future will emerge from all possible futures we are now facing, and it will be shaped by addressing anticipated and past problems and risks. It will also be shaped by the private sector response, by the ongoing megatrends shocks, and at the end of this list, there is policies. That's the only part we actually can control. No one, of course, knows the perfect response, but one thing is crystal clear. Inaction, or action that is framed by a zero-sum view of this bundle of problems. These are not the right ways to handle this situation. Let me mention 2 points about COVID-19 and then focus on climate change. First, this virus will not be effectively tackled by siloed, globally uncoordinated action. The second comes from one of our papers, and that is a striking finding that the pandemic's impact in Asia is very much aggravated by the high share of the informal sector and the resulting very large gaps in social protection, More than half of those in need have no social protection cover at all. Now, turning to the climate resilient development path, neither government nor the private sector can do this, can place the economy on such a path on their own. Both have a complementary role to play, each according to their comparative advantage. The private sector, where the market works, it just needs to follow market signals and do what it does best, bring its innovative and competitive forces to bear and move things forward. The government, on the other hand, needs to regulate when it can address market failures, because the market does fail on occasion, and ensuring a level playing field for private sector actors. Unlike in Hollywood movies, where they have the luxury of tackling villains one after the other as they politely wait for their turn, we don't have that luxury. Given the lags in the impact of climate change action, we need to respond now to both COVID-19 and climate change. Fiscal space is needed to do so, to safeguard incomes, social peace, and also to invest to place the economy on a climate resilient development path. And this includes hard to abate sectors, such as transportation, cement, construction. This is not impossible. In fact, it is a policy choice, admittedly a hard one. Governments can actually create significant fiscal space and, importantly, recurrent fiscal space year after year by addressing what I call fiscal termites, tax havens, tax evasion, or tax avoidance by multinational companies using transfer pricing, the untaxed digital economy, and on the expenditure side, white elephant investment projects and fossil fuel subsidies that in fact boost emissions rather than reduce them. I always like to quote rule number 1 of crisis management, which clearly applies here. When you find yourself in a hole, first stop digging. So stop doing the things which work against your objectives. That's already a very good beginning. In this approach, the relative price of renewables versus fossil fuels is a central issue, because these are the prices that govern the private sector. They govern the billions of daily production, consumption, and investment decisions, which drive overall demand for energy and for whatever things we do that lead to emissions. Setting fossil fuel prices right is critical. We can do that by eliminating fossil fuel subsidies, auctioning off a limited supply of emissions permits for money for the large immobile emitters, and taxing the rest of the emitters through a carbon tax. This will increase the supply of renewable-based energy, reduce the demand for fossil fuel-based energy, and help balance demand and supply at a much lower level. Thus, it is a critical contribution to a low emission path. It's important to note that 2020 has brought an inflection point. New land-based solar and wind power generation now has lower unit cost than coal power generation. This is a result of a trend that is set to continue. Renewables are going to become cheaper, benefiting from a rapid learning curve driven by rising scale and technological advances. This has a very important implication. Any investment in coal power plants from today is bound to create stranded assets. Why is that? Because the output from all power plants, whether fossil fuel based or renewable, is the same. It's dancing electrons. The price of these is driven by the cheapest technology available at scale. As renewables further push down the electricity price for all producers in the future, coal power generation created by today's investment will become loss-making. And it will become loss-making well within its planned lifetime. That makes them stranded assets. They are unable to pay their way and they are unable to repay the loans that finance them. I would also like to say that in thinking about what government needs to do in terms of these fiscal stimulus packages, we need to redefine the objective from always catching up with demand and taking demand as given. And the objective actually needs to be balancing demand and supply. Just increasing demand all the time is very costly at the margin and it raises emissions. Instead, we equally also have to manage demand. The daily time profile of electricity needs or demand that stems from obsolete production technologies and wasteful consumption or misallocated investment. The key point is that often it is less expensive to reduce energy demand by a unit than to increase supply by the same unit. I'd like to link to something that Bastian already mentioned. To realistically limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, an upfront step decline in emissions is needed in the coming years. Otherwise, we'll be in deep trouble. The more greenhouse gas emissions we add, the more we have to reverse. The worse the air quality, water quality, and soil quality will become. And critically, we are unleashing deadly feedback loops. We are setting them in motion right now, and these will escalate climate change and devastate the biocapacity of the planet to sustain life. Just a few examples: methane emissions from thawing permafrost in Siberia, forest fires that both reduce carbon sinks and emit CO2, loss of glaciers in the Himalayas, the loss of polar ice cover that reduces the reflection of sunlight from Earth. All of these synergistically worsen the situation. Let me just close on one thought. Global coordination is key. Countries can't do this alone. Several of the necessary policy measures are viable only if a critical mass of countries, cities, and corporations and other actors go along with them. Countries also have to avoid cutting their own emissions by reallocating them to other countries. And the key example of that is financing coal power plants in other countries. 3 Asian countries are leading this, and they are China, Japan, and Korea. Encouragingly, all 3 countries have very recently taken highly promising actions on emissions reduction. Let me stop here and hand back to Bastian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ballas, and a very resounding call about the urgency of action that it's needed, not only from public-private sector actors, but also to look at the economic and financial imperatives of an increasingly more cost-efficient way to reduce demand, to provide supply of renewable sources of energy, and to recognize the higher relative cost of continuing in the traditional fossil fuel paths that we were on. I believe your remarks are setting the stage for us to have a good conversation later on about how we can leap ahead and take some very innovative and well-informed steps from both the private sector as well as public sector actors to start making a difference here in this region. I'd like to follow up with one quick question, Mr. Ballas, because you talked about earlier the importance of pricing and also the managing the demand and supply of energy. Um, what could be some suggestions from you about some initial but yet specific action that you think private sector actors may already want to consider? Managing pricing and adjusting the demand and supply behavior are rather complex and potentially heavy lifts to have to accomplish in a short time. So do you have some early suggestions for some specific action that private sector actors may already start to take now so that they can support the kinds of changes that you're talking about?
The very first one is set the playing field level. Make it pay to invest in renewables and don't subsidize fossil fuels because that sends the wrong signal. But there are very concrete steps that can be made. And when I talked about the composition of what governments need to do, the fiscal stimulus packages, this is what I had in mind. Make the grid smarter. That has a huge amount of that can pave the way for increasing the share of renewables, which are intermittent by their nature. So there is a need for a much smarter grid to make it possible to use it. Use advanced transmission and power storage technologies. Again, once the prices are right, I have every confidence the private sector will figure it out. They already are making progress, and suddenly, if they can make a killing from this, they will do so. Use the existing fossil fuel-based basis that is already in place to balance the system, the electricity system, and don't add to it. That will go a very long way to addressing the variability of renewables. Manage demand, mainly through prices, but also through market-based aggregator companies in electricity again. They can just pay for some large users to reduce their demand for 2 hours. And that can, again, balance the system. Let me stop here. Thanks very much. There are many steps that can be taken.
Excellent, Mr. Ballas. I'm sure we'll hear more from you about some other ideas as we get into the dialogue, but what a way to set us into this conversation. I'd like to now invite Meg from ClimateWorks Australia to please turn on your video camera and your microphone. I'd like to invite you, Meg, to maybe just kick off this conversation here by sharing what had been ClimateWorks Australia's recent work in this space, and perhaps particularly address some of the questions that we have previously discussed about the importance of having a well-informed and transparent marketplace for both private and public sectors to take action. I can imagine that if we were to bring about some of the suggestions and outcomes that Mr. Ballas is talking about, we will need to be much better informed about the various moving parts of this space and the interdependence on other sectors. So Meg, I'll hand the microphone over to you to share some of what you've been working on.
Thanks so much, Patsy Ann, and good morning everyone, or good afternoon if you're in the same time zone as I am. So ClimateWorks, so the focus of our work overall is on thinking through how to support the transition towards net zero emissions. So we tend to do a lot of work that focuses on looking at the transition overall out to 2050 and what changes need to happen across the economy between now and then to achieve net zero goal, ideally in line with 1.5 degrees as the science indicates we need to focus on. So that includes a lot of work around supporting governments to set net zero targets by 2050 and understand the pathways, the technology choices and the policy options that they need to consider to get there. We've also, and so just a couple of examples I can provide on this actually. In Australia, where I'm based, we've designed a net zero pathway for Australia in line with 1.5 degrees, and it shows that that is both achievable and economically viable, even for a sort of an emissions intensive economy like Australia. And while that level of ambition may not be reflected in our national climate policy targets, many people may not realise that actually all of our subnational governments in Australia, all of our states and territories have set net zero by 2050 targets, and many of those states are well on the way to implementing and achieving those. We're also doing work at the moment with the Kingdom of Tonga in the Pacific to support them to develop a net zero by 2050 strategy. And I think what's really interesting in the case of Pacific Islands is that they are responsible for virtually none of the world's emissions, yet they are actively taking a leadership role. Fiji already has a net zero target. The Marshall Islands already has a net zero target. And the reason for that is because they are, of course, highly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And it's actually pretty much an existential threat to their future existence. So working with the government of Tonga in relation to that. And we've also been doing a lot of other work that's quite complementary to that development of net zero long-term pathways. The first one of those is a report we published just a couple of months back, or a guide, I should say. We call it the Investment Vision Guide. And the focus of this is on helping governments in developing countries to understand how to unlock the investment that's needed to support the achievement of their long-term strategies. So what are the changes that are needed, both in terms of the policy signals they send, in terms of the human capacity requirements, supply chain development, and those sorts of things? What are those sorts of shifts that are needed to enable money to flow, private money to flow? And then also, what should government focus on investing in the short and medium term by considering some of the transition risks and the sort of no regrets actions that can be taken, particularly in the short term, to really sort of kickstart that transition for them. And we've also done work that is, I think, quite complementary to that. The work of long-term strategies typically focuses on how you move from where you are today to, towards a decarbonised economy. So how do you remove carbon from the economy? Where are all the ways that you need to, clean up your electricity sector, clean up industry, shift to electric vehicles, reforestation and things like that. But those approaches, long-term strategies, often don't also consider the huge economic opportunities that the transition can offer as well. So we did a series of reports last year, studies, that looked at 3 countries in Southeast Asia. We looked at Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines to understand what comparative advantages each of those countries already had in terms of low carbon technologies. And the results of that were actually really interesting because overall those countries aren't seen as kind of global leaders in relation to low carbon technologies, but Asia overall is on the cusp of competitiveness in that respect. And often what we found is that existing industries can be quite easily pivoted towards low carbon technology production. So some really exciting opportunities that focus on the economic growth opportunity that comes from the transition that we looked at there. I might leave it there, Patsy, unless there was another question you wanted to throw to me at this stage.
No, I think we are very glad to have your examples just shared about the economic opportunity from transitioning economies like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Philippines. And I'd like to pick up a little bit more on that as we get into the dialogue. Thank you so much for the introduction, Meg. And I'd like to also remind the audience that that we will also be sharing some information about some reports and studies that ClimateWorks Australia has done to help us better understand the economic opportunities and investment landscape that she has been referring to. So Meg, we'll come back to you for the dialogue, but thank you for introducing us into this thread on the topic, because it's a good segue now to Mr. Mohammad Batyus, Ms. Mohammad Yusriki. Batyus, your presentation today is going to be really insightful because we are really delighted to hear more about what you are specifically doing as a private sector actor in Indonesia about the challenges that we talked about today. So Batyus, the microphone is now yours.
Hi everyone, good morning and good afternoon for those in the different time zone with me. I'm from Basis Investment. We are an investment company and renewable energy is part of our investment strategy. The role that we choose for our investment is investor developer role. We are actively developing projects at early stage, all the way through operational stage. We firmly believe that renewable energy is the next wave of energy investment, and after oil and coal, that will not only present Indonesia with abundant opportunities in growth, but also support global commitment in the greenhouse gas reduction. Sumba for Indonesia is one of the, I think, major project that we are working on today, right now, with the regional government of Nusa Tenggara Timur, or East Nusa Tenggara, is in the eastern part of Indonesia. You can see from the deck that I provided. So this is basically to scale up the renewable generation project in Indonesia, which currently, if you know that we still have small and clustered project here and there within the country. So this 20 gigawatt renewable generation is the plan, and we will bring the generation the power to the center of demand, which is located in Java, Bali system. So it's the project will also construct 900-kilometer undersea and overland interconnection transmission, and we estimated around $18 billion investment in total, and the impact that we trying to calculate with the JEDI model. I think more than 300,000 jobs opportunities we will create over 5 years time, and more than 13 billion addition to Indonesian GDP, and of course will also have an impact to local economic development, which if you look at these islands, is actually there are 3 provinces. It's East Nusa Tenggara and West Nusa Tenggara. If some of you know Lombok Island, and Bali Island, which is also a different province. So each of the islands or provinces that will have the transmission will also have, we believe, can also give an impact to those area of economic development. So basically, that's the project that we are working together. We'll discuss it in more detail when we have the dialogue. I'll give it back to Patien.
Thank you so much, Pak Yus. I'd like to ask the tech team in the background, please, to help me turn on my video, as I seem to have a little bit of difficulty. In the meantime, I'd like to say thank you very much to our panelists for sharing your early comments. But Yus in particular, I think we want to dig a little bit deeper into how your journey has been as a private sector operator who has established this ambition for what we want to do, what you want to do in Indonesia in partnership with the government. But let me now invite all our speakers to please turn on your microphones, your video, apologize. Mr. Balas, Meg, and Pak Yus. And we're going to go into the dialogue section of our agenda for today. Mr. Balas, I wanted to come back to you really quickly and also kind of follow up on my earlier question. I asked you earlier about what are some of the early things that the private sector actors can do to achieve the types of outcomes that you mentioned in your remarks. But also following now what Meg and Pak Yus had shared, I'd like to ask you to maybe set off the conversation with talking a little bit on the other side about what governments can do differently. You know, the case is compelling. What you've presented is very clear, and I would be curious to know, what do you think governments have to do differently to actually get traction in this?
I think governments need to realize that there are places of comparative advantage for them, and there are places where they really aren't the right actor. And they just need to focus on the areas where they do have comparative advantage. Governments alone can screw everything up. But if they do things right, they cannot make it happen, but they can make it possible. That together with the private sector, and in fact with civil society and with ordinary people, they can make it happen. And it's the symbiotic relationship that needs to be realized. Governments absolutely need to address market failures. Lord Nicholas Stern, when he talked about in his famous report about climate change, he said this is the largest market failure in the history of mankind. There are things that government needs to do to set things right. It needs to address monopoly positions. It needs to address areas where there are public good nature. There's a characteristic of public good of what is being done, and of course the elephant in the room is externalities. And this in particular is something the government absolutely needs to do. When I burn coal, I impose an externality on each and every one of you and your children and grandchildren. And this is something that needs to come back as a cost to me. And this kind of costing is absolutely crucial. But another part is set the level playing field. And subsidies really distort that. If I give subsidies to fossil fuels, I am saying, please burn as much of this stuff as you can, because I'm making it cheap for you. And by the same token, I'm saying, no, don't work on renewables, because that's relatively more expensive. These are things that governments need to consider. And the final thing I want to mention is returning to what I said earlier. No government can do this on its own. There is a very stable equilibrium of everyone giving subsidies, everyone sort of continuing the same old way. And if one government tries to strike out and the others continue persisting in their behavior, it will not work. Simple game theory. And it's very important that governments begin talking with each other, and not in a zero-sum manner. I'm sorry, this world is not a zero-sum world. We have common interests, we have common risks that we need to tackle together and can only tackle together. I hope that answers your question or begins to do so.
Indeed, Mr. Balas, and I'm always amazed by how every time I ask you a question and you answer them, you are also triggering in my mind 10,000 other questions that come from that. But I think it's particularly poignant for me about your point of governments recognizing that even if they may not necessarily create the result, they can make the result possible. And their particular role and areas of comparative advantage is to address some of these public and ecosystem issues like market failures. I want to pick up on that point and now come to you, Meg, about this, because the investment vision guide I thought was really insightful in not only laying out some options for where governments can either set policies to encourage private sector capital to move differently or invest in different ways of strengthening the pathways towards net zero. But I think what I see as an opportunity here is that you are helping to build more readiness and informed capability on the part of governments as an actor in this space. So I wanted to hear from you a little bit about what are your views in how both private sector investors and governments how can they get ready and how can they improve their capability to do this kind of collaboration and coordination that Balas had just mentioned?
Yeah. So I think I completely agree with Balazs's sentiments that government plays such a critical role here in sending the right signals, and without those signals, private finance will continue to flow where it always flows. So from the perspective of government, one of the most important things that they can do is to set really clear and targeted and ambitious climate goals. And then create the space for investment to flow. So long-term climate goals in line with with countries' commitments to the Paris Agreement, renewable energy targets, electric vehicle targets, and so on. Set those very clear market signals and then ensure that market distortions, exactly as Balazs mentioned, removal of fossil fuel subsidies, those things that create an uneven playing field and mean that those clean technologies, which can compete incredibly effectively with fossil fuels, if the playing field is level, remove those things, those market distortions, so that the money can flow there. And money, green finance, colourless finance, brown finance, money will flow where the signals are indicating that it should go, because the role of investors is to make money. So when those market signals are really clear, that's what will happen. And I'm just going to give actually one example that I think paints a really perfect picture of the type of signalling that government can do, and the kind of rapid deployment of technologies that we can see when that happens. So in Vietnam, they set a feed-in tariff for utility scale solar PV. This was about a couple of years ago, and it had a deadline, I think, of about middle of last year. And in the last year of that program, of that opportunity to access that feed-in tariff, the generation capacity, the online capacity for large-scale renewable energy increased from about 10 megawatts, which is enough to power about 6,500 homes. So from 10 megawatts of installed capacity to 4 gigawatts, which is about enough to power 2.5 million homes. That happened in the space of 1 year because the right signals were there from government. So when the signals are right, when the conditions are right, the money will flow where you want it to go.
Thanks very much for that example, Meg. And I think, being able to step up and setting those signals are certainly, the first step. Really exciting also in terms of the kinds of opportunities that you're already seeing coming from Indonesia and the Philippines. Let's just talk about Indonesia for a second, because I'd like to then follow this point with Pak Yus as well. Meg, in your study so far in Indonesia, what are some of the insights that you're seeing about both government and private sector players transitioning into taking advantage of these economic opportunities, right? So we talked about, for example, government players being ready to set targets and establish signals. What do you see the private sector players doing as well to get ready to take advantage of these kinds of investment opportunities that are being presented? That would be interesting for us to know, and maybe for some of the audience to perhaps adopt some best practices from.
Yeah. So the example that springs to mind in Indonesia would be around electric vehicles and the battery supply chain. So this was actually one of the findings in the research that we did last year, looking at comparative advantages in Indonesia, Vietnam and the Philippines. Indonesia has really rich natural resources of nickel and bauxite, both of which are very valuable minerals used in the production of batteries. And Indonesia, sort of over the last couple of years, has limited the access by international, by other countries to those resources, with a view to scaling up domestic production. So we're seeing, some very good policy signals from government around both the creation of a battery industry, as well as around creation of electric vehicle industries, such as electric scooters, that work together with the battery industry. And so what we're seeing is really good policy signals and movement starting to happen domestically. And one example, I'm actually going to give a public sector example in this sort of, because I think it's a really interesting one. And this is actually in relation to Pertamina, which is Indonesia's state-owned oil and gas, sort of extraction and processing company. And, so it extracts and exports, is responsible for exporting a lot of fossil fuels to other countries. But also it is now positioning itself to be the largest producer of batteries in Indonesia. So it's quite a big shift from the sort of stuff that it's been doing so far, but it's a really smart move tactically. Firstly, because Indonesia's reserves, particularly of oil, are declining, so that market is drying up. Secondly, because what we've been seeing over recent years, and particularly in the context of COVID, is quite significant volatility in the price of commodity prices for fossil fuels. And thirdly, because this is a really key growth opportunity, both for the company and for Indonesia overall. It has these mineral resources, so it's positioning itself really well to sort of carve a niche out in that market globally.
Thanks very much for this, Meg, and wonderful examples and a great segue for us to now come to you, Batyus. You know, as a private sector player in this, you know, in this space, and now having started with this project in Sumba, I'm really interested to hear a little bit more insight from you about what was it like to engage in this type of collaboration. You know, you are working on this project also very closely with the government. You are engaging and inviting other market operators to join you as well. What are some of your insights and experiences in terms of mobilizing all these different stakeholders to join you and to work with you?
Well, as I think most of you know that uh, it's part of the largest contribution of greenhouse gas emission. The electricity sectors in Indonesia currently lag significantly compared to the emission reduction target. So I think from uh, today's situation, which is we have only 9-10% maximum of the energy mix. I think private sector is the most important party here to support Indonesian government, not to miss the 23% target of energy mix in 2025. And a lot of investors, mostly foreign investors, is lining up to help the government since the first time the government uh, committed to the Paris Agreement in 2015. And both of them think within this today economic situation, the government as well as the state-owned enterprise, uh, which basically only have one utility company, PLN, cannot do so much to achieve the target, the government target. So today, from my experience since I think 3-4 years, we are waiting. We've been waiting basically. What would be the next step of what the government can do to how you call it, to accelerate uh, the the uh, the generation of renewable energy in this country. So that's what I think most of the uh, foreign investors now is waiting. That's what I can catch from the discussion, the interaction so far within the market.
Thank you very much, Batyus. And it's really encouraging to hear that, right? That you know that the private sector actors are almost acting in solidarity to say that they're waiting for these kinds of opportunities now to transition to a committed government and a public response that gives this opportunity for investment capital to move. Um, I'll come back to you with a different question about the implications to how private sector resources are going into this space. But I wanted to now turn the question over to Mr. Ballas because there is a question from the audience that I think, you know, when we think about what Yus has just shared, that the private sector players are ready, they're waiting for market, for government action and government signals. The question from the audience here is that knowing government role is critical in this case, what do you see as the status quo of government action in Southeast Asian countries dealing with the renewable energy climate action imperative? Is there actually promising development or are you just seeing some political norms? Mr. Ballas, would you like to address that question?
Yes, thank you. And I think it's a very good question because it's very easy to paint a very negative picture. It's very easy to say, oh, everyone is talking, it's all hot air, nothing is happening. Let me give you an example from the area of coal power plants, which is one segment of this. But and the very broad kinds of politically declared large long-term goals that Meg has talked about. China's President Xi has just declared at the UN General Assembly a very ambitious target for peaking carbon emissions by 2030 and reaching net zero by 2060. This is an absolutely large change in the official line of the largest emitter in the world. And that really can be a game changer. And this is not just talk. This actually means that the 14th five-year plan, which was supposed to start on January 1st, and in China's way of managing the economies, plays a very central role. It just has to be revamped. If you work back from that, what needs to happen in the next 5 years, a lot needs to happen. So right now they are feverishly working on this and considering how exactly they can set the economy on that path. South Korea has just announced a very ambitious domestic emissions target. Japan announced that they will cease financing coal power plants. This comes on top of the World Bank and European Investment Bank and Asian Development Bank declaring the same. They will no longer fund coal power plant building. So what I am saying is that after a frustratingly long period where there was mostly talk, a tipping point might be in sight. I am not yet ready to declare victory on this, but good things might suddenly be happening. Over to you.
Thank you. I think, Meg, you'd like to also add on to that comment.
I would, because I actually think that those signals that Balazs has flagged in relation to the ambitious mid-century decarbonisation targets that have been set recently by China, South Korea and Japan are incredibly interesting from a regional dynamic perspective. Yes. If you think about ASEAN, ASEAN already has very favourable trade agreements with those three countries. And is already, exporting a lot of componentry, for example, to those countries. And what's maybe not, sort of being missed in this discussion about these targets, which is fantastic, is the recognition that those three countries are also the three global leaders in the production of low carbon technologies today, by a long shot. So, it would be lovely to think that they are acting purely out of altruism and for the benefit of the planet. But I would, hedge a calculated bet that there is quite a lot of deep thinking that's been going on behind the scenes, and they see this as a clear and surefire way to secure their economic future. So the implications, I think, for Southeast Asia are really, really interesting. Because many Southeast Asian countries currently supply fossil fuels to and other emissions intensive products to those three countries. So governments need to be on notice, and financial institutions that are investing in those resources need to be on notice that there will be a decline in that demand from those countries going forward. But the flip side of that is the huge opportunity that this presents. So in most ASEAN countries have labour costs and manufacturing costs significantly below those of China, Japan and South Korea. So the potential to scale up supply chains to supply the sorts of components and technologies that Japan, Korea and China will require to both meet their own significant decarbonisation needs, but also to help them in their efforts to continue to supply global supply chains as global demand grows. This is a huge opportunity for Southeast Asia, and one that shouldn't be overlooked.
I think, Meg, you've hit the point there about the role also of Southeast Asia and the implications for other elements of the economy and livelihood development, right? Which is with respect to job creation. And I think also Pat Yus mentioned earlier about his project is also targeting to create significant number of jobs as well. And I wanted to kind of bring this discussion to the element that also, you know, we started out our session with, which is that there's a clear interdependency for where what climate resilience means also when it comes to economic and social resilience. And you know, in terms of the kind of audience that have been looking at this, we also see that there is potentially a role to play beyond energy sector companies in this space. So I wanted to maybe direct this question at both Pak Yus and also at you, Megan. If you look at the kinds of private sector actors that need to be involved in really advancing this, what do you foresee maybe some challenges that they are already encountering, and that we may need to address so that they can actively engage? So maybe I'll ask you, Pak Yus, to address your experience in Indonesia, and please comment also, you know, more broadly about the other interdependent private sector players that you do have to work with in order to make this successful. And then Megan, maybe you could add on your comments also just broadly around the ASEAN region as well. Pak Yus, may I ask you to start, please?
I'd love to hear Indonesia do the same things like Megan has mentioned in Vietnam. 1 year, 4 gigawatt. And if you look at the timeline, that was, I think Indonesia and Vietnam has the same starting point. If I'm not mistaken, less than 100 megawatt renewable generation at that time to 2015. And in 1 year, like Megan said, Indonesia 0 growth of renewable and Vietnam 4 gigawatt. So the challenge is like what Dallas said, the signal from the government, the inconsistency of policy. That's what we all think the main roadblocks for renewable energy in Indonesia. Since this administration was in the office to 2014, I think we have many up and down situation. 2015, we also have a kind of FIT policy, but then not, I think, not 2 years, less than 2 years, we stopped and nothing happened until now. Now we're waiting for presidential regulation, which been discussing together with the government. There will be a FIT, new FIT is coming in, and on that regulation, but still not coming out. Now there's another big things coming, new bill, the renewable energy bills. We are now working together with the DPR, the Parliament, to discuss to make a very strong foundation for this industry's growth in Indonesia. But to be realistic, I think next year, early next year, if we can push very hard. So that's number one, that I think the biggest challenge in this market. The second, the structure, the market structure. Even today, the narrative of green recovery is everywhere in all ministry. But the market structure is just not fit to the to justify the green recovery. We have monolithic structure. If I think you understand, we only have PLN as the single buyer, our only utility company. They do have their own strategic energy plan, which consider for most of us as a government strategic policy. Is a bit funny, yes, it is, because the energy transition is not their KPI. The energy transition, it should be government KPI. So we need to do something on this market structure. I believe Megan also understands the situation in this market. Most of the, I think on top of that, we see the government, now we start questioning the government of Indonesia, a way that we think then has not embraced the energy transition in developing renewable energy policy. Instead of transitioning to renewable energy, I look at the government, I see the government has the view of fulfilling electricity growth by renewable energy. Especially with today's situation, this fulfillment view naturally will be questioned during the pandemic, right? With the demand of electricity falling rapidly due to restriction of various activities and plummeting global demand. I don't see this renewable energy will be the agenda for next 2 or 3 years, right? If they only see this as a fulfillment of energy growth, because no growth at all, right? Can you imagine if 2-3 years we start everything? It's only 2023. Definitely will be too late to achieve 23% energy mix target without clear and strong strategic directives on renewable energy. So I think Megan can see from out of the box, from outside, more clearly on how things happen in Indonesian market.
Thanks very much, Pak Yus. And Meg, please do share also what you see as some critical challenges that we have to overcome. And if I may ask you to expand your answer a little bit also, just given the audience that we have, what do you think impact capital funders, whether they're impact investors, whether they're foundations, and the role that they can play to potentially overcome some of these challenges as well? Meg, over to you.
Yeah. Such interesting comments from Pak Yus, and I am familiar with the complexity of the energy transition in Indonesia, and I feel like that's a topic for a whole other webinar. We could spend hours on that. But I think, you know, some of the you know, sort of challenges and barriers that we're certainly aware of relate to, you know, it is a very nascent market in Indonesia, and so there aren't well-established supply chains often for, you know, the technologies, the skills that are needed to build and implement those technologies. And just one example that springs to mind comes from a conversation with a developer, an energy developer, and they were doing a large-scale wind project. And they couldn't access the quality of cement needed to build the foundations to hold the wind towers up, because they are huge, if anyone's ever stood underneath one of them. So what ended up happening as they went to install this wind facility was that they had to buy a cement manufacturing plant as well in order to ensure that they could get the quality of cement needed. So some of those changes that are often unforeseen and add significant costs to the project up front, I think are real challenges, and that uncertainty, because the market is undeveloped, you know, is a big risk because of those sorts of factors. And, you know, the private sector is in the business of making money, so also making sure that the market structures enable, you know, those businesses to roll out projects in a way that is very, very cost competitive. And some of the challenges that we sometimes see around that are things like, you know, local content rules, which are designed, you know, from a very good perspective in terms of wanting to scale up a domestic industry. But sometimes what ends up happening is project developers can't access the quality or the technologies at the right cost to make those projects really competitive, where they might be able to access some of those components more cheaply in another country. So there's, some of those trade-offs really have to be thought through, I think, in a little bit more detail. And then, of course, access to finance. So again, particularly for technologies that are more nascent or markets that are more nascent, the access to capital at the right cost, the risk of those investments, is a huge barrier to greater deployment. So there's really, I think, an important role to thinking about, what sort of blended finance instruments can be used, or what other sorts of mechanisms such as long-term contracts, for example, that give greater certainty, particularly for those early movers, is really important. And the other thing that I was just going to add from, sort of the government perspective is, particularly when industries are newer, and this applies not just to renewable energy, but for electric vehicles, for energy efficiency technologies, and so on. Government can play a really, really important role as an early mover in order to grow those supply chains and that domestic capability. And it can do this through its own procurement efforts. So government, for example, if it rolls out an initiative to improve the efficiency of government buildings, firstly, that reduces costs for government. But secondly, it creates a whole industry that didn't previously exist or was pretty small. Similarly with electric vehicles, they create that demand because governments are big. So I think I'll leave it there.
I think that's a really good point, especially that last one about growing the domestic capacity for this. And I would even make the case that even the major private sector players, particularly in markets where there are monopolistic players, that they can also play a role in creating that kind of domestic capacity as well. I wanted to address one last question from the audience, and I'm going to combine two questions together, which is that, we've heard many times now from all three of you the importance of government to be able to establish the signaling and to create the market space. How do you think leading companies, or in fact even just leading philanthropic or impact capital players can trigger this with government? How can they approach government to start this process and get them into the space of being willing and ready to talk about creating market space like that? Particularly since we are talking about organizations and ranging from very important and critical foundations in certain markets. We're also talking about some major companies whose CSR capital can be very significant. What role do we think these kinds of impact capital players can contribute towards triggering and catalyzing this kind of movement by government? Maybe I'll start with you, Meg, and then we'll come to you, Yus, and then to you, Mr. Balas, at the end.
I think, sort of back to the focus of the conversation around green recovery, I guess I would just flag that we have this really unique opportunity at the moment where governments are cash strapped. Their incomes have been reduced because businesses have, slowed down. People have lost jobs. There's less tax income for countries that are exporting, goods and resources, and particularly energy. These have all been hit by the global economic downturn. So governments are cash strapped, yet they know they need to invest a lot to kickstart their economies. So I think there's really a role here for impact investors to push what they can offer, and to make that a really attractive offer to governments. Most governments, certainly in Southeast Asia, are very, very focused on increasing attraction of FDI. They want to be increasing those finance flows from outside the country as well as domestically. And I think, as I flagged, that this opportunity around the green recovery or around the economic recovery provides an opportunity for impact investors to signal that they are willing to invest in green sectors and green recovery. So a bit of pressure on government, but also solving a problem that governments are really grappling with at the moment.
Thank you very much, Meg. How about you, your perspective, also given that you yourself are representing an investment company? What do you think?
I think the most important for the government today is, and as well as to the PLN, is to start looking at the opportunity to work together with the private sectors. But as we all know that private money cannot start with nothing. And if this is something that impact investor can do, I think to do the risking by putting the pre-FS on the table, by giving the government or even PLN to start with doing the pre-FS. Particularly on Sumba initiative that we are working on, we say to the government that we are ready to even to do the pre-FS for the generation, but we also say the transmission is very important, and it's not for PLN or government to invest, because we understand the economic situation is very hard for them. So maybe is a time to initiate the new model of doing it by having PPP scheme, which I believe a lot of investors will be interested to help the government and as well as PLN to build 900 kilometers interconnection, or even to the whole national Indonesian interconnection grid, which is very important for the renewable to come into the system, because we know like Sumatra have a lot of hydro power. We have East Indonesia has a huge potential of solar as well as geothermal. So we can't do this without the interconnection, which I think will play important role to get the renewables energy come into the system. Kalimantan, for example, Kalimantan is very, very, very big potential for hydro as well. And but those areas that I mentioned is not where the demand is located. The demand is in Java Island. More than 70% of total demand of electricity industries, the RE100 companies is in Java Island. So we need to bring them into Java Island. So the interconnection of national, let's say Indonesian national grid is become dream for quite some time.
Right.
And it takes billions. That's where I think very important for impact investor to come to the government and say, let's do something to start. A lot of professors, scholars are talking about this. It's been a while, but nothing happened.
So now is the time for action then.
Yes,
Indeed,
yes.
indeed. Let me turn to you, Mr. Balas, for the closing comment as we are nearing the end of our session. Sorry, Mr. Balas, your microphone is still muted.
I always do that. Sorry about that. So fantastic discussion, and I think very, very, very impactful interventions. Let me say that this ambitious goal setting that we suddenly are observing by very large countries in Asia is not only political positioning, it is also a recognition that there is a critical role of attaining scale in all the things that we are talking about. And the first to attain scale will have a huge first mover advantage. So suddenly, given the comparative advantages of many countries in Asia, and the realization that if I move first, I will have a lot more gain than the latecomers. This is one of the reasons why there is now this sudden movement, and that is what is giving me hope. There's nothing wrong with that. And countries and governments of other countries really need to make sure that they are not among the latecomers to this. And then that is finally some competition among governments for the global good. I think another point I'd like to make is that the lack of long-term financing is a market failure. And this happens to be an area where you need long-term financing for the kinds of infrastructure projects we are talking about. There are others where long-term financing is not needed, but in many areas it is. This is actually why why the development banks were created, government development banks and international ones. I think it is very important that these investment banks get in the game and they team up with impact investors. They team up even with private finance. The way private finance can be brought in is if governments say, hey, I see that there is an asset class here. There is something that is uniform, that is common to the kinds of investments that Indonesia and Vietnam and China and Japan are talking about. Let's have commonly agreed regulations and standards. That's the basis. Then you create an asset class and all these smart investment banker types will work on their computers and come in. Okay, now I can slice and dice this because there are common regulations and standards. So a lot of things can get moving if we do it the smart way. Governments can play their role and private sector can play their role. Back to you.
Excellent, Mr. Balas. I don't need to make any more concluding remarks now, given your very good closing for us. But I think just to particularly reaffirm the point that in addition to the governments being ready to play that signaling role and addressing market failures, you have a private sector who is ready and willing and is now looking at the opportunities offered by either from the transitioning into low carbon economy or other very clear energy needs where they are looking for opportunity to partner up and collaborate alongside government as an enabler. But there are a few things that we need, and that's where impact capital can potentially play a role. We talked about the importance of being able to de-risk some of these investments, being able to support the scaling up, the long-term growth and the financing needs that accompany that. We talk about the importance of developing domestic demand and supply chain that will allow that to happen. And also the very important role of providing access to finance where there is a need, particularly in some of the undertapped markets, like as you mentioned, in areas like Kalimantan, for example. And I think the role that we can see impact capital playing is going to be a very long list of opportunities, and we won't finish them all here, but I believe this has been a great discussion to get us going. So thank you to all the panelists and to you, Mr. Balas, for your opening remarks. Thank you to the audience for your very active questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them, but we'll try to address them offline and in as much as we can. And I know we've run a bit over time, but I'm very grateful for your attention. And I'd like to ask all of the audience as well to just do a virtual applause or a thank you to our panelists for their time and attention today. Thanks everybody for your interest. And if you still have another 30 seconds, we welcome you to please share with us some of your upcoming climate-centered initiatives that are collaborating with both private sector and public sector partners. You can see a short poll on screen. If you'd like to share your work with us, just do a little tick where it says yes, and we will get in touch with you. Thank you again for everyone's attention, and we wish you a very good afternoon from ABPN and UNDP. Thank you very much.